Good morning. Our scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of his word.
Well, I'm not sure if any of you remember it, but in the 1980s, there was a song that came out entitled, "Your Love is Canceled." It came out in 1981, and you probably don't remember because it's not on any top hits of the 80s or anything like that. It was a breakup song, and it compared the breakup of a relationship to a favorite TV show being canceled, right? And it's significant because this is the first time, in our pop culture today that word canceled was applied to a person. About a decade later, New Jack City movie came out. Wesley Snipes used a line from that song in order to end a relationship where he said to his girlfriend and breaking up with her, "You're canceled." And even, I get that, I know 80s and 90s seems a lifetime ago, but from those small, auspicious examples comes our modern day language around someone being canceled. Fast forward 20, 25 years, and we reach the point, especially over the last decade, where just about anyone in a prominent position or in a public place can be canceled for saying the wrong thing, for doing something terrible, or even sometimes just by associating with those who have skeletons in their past. Just about anyone can be canceled. And, maybe, I mean, you can probably think of people who have been canceled, right? Whether it's comedians, movie stars, political personalities, newscasters, business icons, right? All of us can think of people, notable examples who've been canceled, and in some cases, at least the ones I think of, maybe they deserve something, that. They didn't deserve the pedestal they were on. But on the flip side, I can think of people who were canceled not because of something awful they did, but just because they held an unpopular political position, something that estranged them from one half of the country or the other. I guess what I'm trying to get at is this whole idea of being canceled, it's tricky. I think it is important in our culture to hold people accountable for what they say and what they do, especially if what they say and do hurts other people. But we also have to be careful because, how do we know when we're canceling others for instance, how do we differentiate between opinion versus disinformation? How do we differentiate between something that brings harm to people versus something that we just don't like? How do we know how long someone's past counts against them? Does it destroy any future benefit or hope they might bring to the world? Ultimately, I think this business of canceling culture, it's a challenge for us, because if we're not careful, we bless and sanction a mob mentality that can turn on just about anyone for saying it creates this feeling of fear in all of us that anyone, anytime can be canceled. Last week, I mentioned a book, Andy Stanley's book, Not In It to Win It. And he talks about cancel culture in ways that I found particularly profound. He says, for one thing, he points out the problems with cancel culture. The first thing he says, one of the problems with cancel culture is that it tends to hyper-focus on an individual instance. One thing someone does, one thing someone says, and that cancels out the rest of their life, all the good things they might have done. He says, if you say one thing I disagree with or I don't like, then I'm going to discount everything you've ever said, along with everything you've ever accomplished. Think about people that we have canceled. Even think about maybe even some of the founders of our country, which now, history has brought forth things in their lives that aren't so good. And maybe they shouldn't have ever been up on a pedestal, but there seems to be this national glee in pulling people down from their pedestals. And I think it's a failure in many cases to recognize that God sometimes can use very flawed people to accomplish his will. How many heroes of the Bible would we cancel in today's culture, right? And not only that, that cancel culture creates a standard that none of us would want to live in. Again, back to Andy Stanley, he says, if we allow a single moment to cancel the work and accomplishments of a lifetime, we embrace a standard to which we hope never to be held accountable ourselves, because how many of us are perfect? How many of us have said the wrong thing at the wrong time, failed to speak up when we should have? How many of us have something in our past that we don't want publicly aired because we're afraid if that came to light, if people do what we said, thought, did, we might be canceled too. Ultimately, Andy says cancel culture lowers our collective IQ because it makes us unable to listen to those who see, interpret, and experience the world differently from us. It's like, I like how he puts it. He says, the truth is that nobody gets it right 100% of the time. Sometimes people that we do not like and that we don't want to be like still get it right. Think about that. Do you recognize that? The people you don't like sometimes get it right. People you don't want to be like sometimes get it right. And he says, so Democrats sometimes get it right. And Republicans sometimes get it right. And Democrats sometimes get it wrong. And Republicans sometimes get it wrong. But when we shut down our ability to listen to the other side, we cut off our ability to see and learn from one another. We end up all wrong. Cancel culture, in the end, Andy says, it doesn't just cancel the right to be wrong, which we all need because none of us is 100% right all the time. But he says it cancels the right to be partially wrong and yet still heard. And don't we all want to be heard, even if we're not 100% right all of the time? So each week in this series, we've been trying to kind of hold up some virtue that I think stands against these challenges that we are experiencing in our culture. In the first week in this series on Do Unto Others, we talked about polarization, this growing divide between right and left. And we talked about kindness and how the simple act of practicing kindness recognizes that we're all kin, that there's much more that unites than divides. And last week we talked about the problem of idolatry. How many of us have bought so deeply into our political parties or our worldviews that those have become idolatrous, that we've put them over and above our faith commitment. They become the primary way we see and interpret the world, our primary identity. And we talked about, well, what we need is more loyalty, to understand what it means to be loyal to Christ and to his kingdom above all else. And this week, when I kind of started us off on a deep, diving straight in, talking about cancel culture, I think the antidote, the antithesis, is respect. The word respect comes from Latin respectus, which means to see or regard. So when you respect someone, you make a commitment to seeing who they are and finding something of value and worth in who they are, even if you disagree with them. That's the essence of respect. And think about how lacking it is in our public discourse and dialogue today. It's a challenge for us because, when someone does something that upsets us or offends us, our natural inclination is to, in some way, cancel them, right? Like I forgot to say this earlier, but I feel like it needs to be said. Everyone participates in cancel culture, right? You may feel like the other side does it more, maybe, but we all participate in it. Even the church, we participate in cancel culture, right? We don't call it that, but you go back through our history, think about how much monstrous violence has been done in the church, by the church, simply in the name of purging heresy. Even today, we don't, maybe produce violence in that way, but we still dismiss, we judge each other, call someone a lib, call someone a fundamentalist, whatever it is, whatever label you attach, it's a way of canceling and dismissing. It's antithetical to the way of Christ. Instead, when we are offended, when we are hurt in some way, if we respond by canceling someone, then what do they do in response? Well, they're going to cancel us right back, right? They're going to unfollow us on social media. They're going to disparage us to their allies, their friends, their neighbors, or they just cut the relationship off. The way of canceling, it's a way of death. It's a dead end. But think about how the path of respect opens up new possibilities. If we can work and try to respect someone, to see who they are, even if we disagree, to listen to them, even if we don't like what we're going to hear, that pathway of respect, it opens up the possibility that there might be more to the relationship, that there might be a future. Someone might cancel you. That happens. That doesn't mean you have to cancel them right back. It might just be by continuing to show respect and love and honor, you keep open a door that someone else is wanting to close. That, to me, is part of the story of the prodigal son, which Linda read for us just a moment ago. Same way we did 2 weeks ago when we did the story of the Good Samaritan. I know it's a story that all of us learned in Sunday school. It's familiar to all of us. I just want us to look at it through a new lens today, look at it through the lens of canceling, because that's exactly what's taking place in the first little bit of this story. The younger son goes to his father and demands his inheritance. And that day, in that culture, he's not just asking for money, he's canceling his dad. He's saying basically to his dad, I wish you were dead so I could have your stuff. I value your stuff more than I value a relationship with you. He canceled it. And he took the inheritance and he went to a far-off country, and he didn't just cancel the dad, he canceled his own history, his own values, his own upbringing. He wanted nothing to do with any of it. And not only that, but the village and the family that he was part of, they would have canceled him in return, because this was a man who turned his back on his people, who thumbed his nose at all their traditions, at their God. He was dead to them. He would have been shunned, canceled forever. The young man went off and he found some new friends, which is what money will get you. But once his money ran out, then what happened? His new friends canceled him. He was of no value, no worth to them. And so they left him broke and penniless. And this young man, the prodigal son, he found himself hungry and poor. So hungry, in fact, that he envied the food that he was giving pigs. This was the lowest of the low, that a Jew would envy an unclean animal, their food. That was the job he had. And in the midst of this, he thinks there has to be a pathway back to getting uncanceled. And he thinks to himself, I'm going to go back to my dad, and I'm going to offer a mea culpa. You know, that's how it works in our society, right? If someone's canceled, how do they get back? Well, they offer a mea culpa. They say what they did and how they're so sorry, and they hope over time to demonstrate, that they're really a good person and to earn everyone's trust back. That's the pathway back. Except when the son gets to the father, that's not what happens at all. The father runs to him, throws his arms around him. He interrupts the son while the son's giving his big speech. The father cancels his mea culpa, says, you don't have to do this at all. I'm just glad you're home. Put the ring on his finger, put the sandals on his feet, put my robe, my best robe around him. Let's kill the fatted calf. He brings him in, because the thing is, what this younger son realizes in that moment is that he has not been canceled after all. He was lost, he was confused, but he was never canceled. He was always loved. And the father throws a party in his honor to restore him to the community. And then we get the crux of the story, because there's an older brother who stayed home, who did his job, who worked the fields, who honored his dad. And this older brother struggles to see how the younger brother is being treated. He refuses. When he comes in from the field, sees the party going on, he refuses to go into the party. Stands outside, demands his dad come out to him. And then when the dad appears, he says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. And I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. And when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Can you see how the older brother is still, like he's canceled his relationship with his brother? He doesn't even say, this brother of mine. He says, this son of yours, I want nothing to do with him. But notice how the father responds. The father wants him to know nothing is canceled at all. My love is the same. He says, son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. My love for this brother of yours does not cancel my love for you. He says, it's only right. We had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours, remember, not this son of mine, this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. My point is the father invites the son not just to come into the party. He invites the son to uncancel his brother. We are invited we are invited to uncancel one another. We're invited to uncancel our enemies, our political opponents, our religious opponents. We are even invited, I think, to uncancel ourselves, to recognize that God's love is bigger than any shame or any guilt or any regret we each carry. And I know this is all true because the Father never stopped loving us. He never canceled us. And to show us this, he allowed his Son to be canceled on our behalf. You think about it, Jesus was canceled, wasn't he? He was unfollowed. Not on social media perhaps, but he was unfollowed. He was unfollowed by the disciples who scattered like sheep. He was unfollowed by his most vocal, loyal friend, the one who first identified him as the Son of God and who promised, even at the end, he would never deny him. He was unfollowed. And he was certainly unfollowed by the crowds that in the space of 1 week's time went from blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord to crucify him. The leaders, the Pilate, Caiaphas, all of them, they aligned themselves against him and nailed him to a cross next to a common criminal. They canceled him. And this is the path that we as Christians say God walked, our Savior walked, so that we might know that we're never canceled. He did that to seek and save the lost, the prodigal. Upon the cross, Jesus canceled our sin. That's what's canceled. Not you, not me, but your sin, whatever it is, it's canceled. Jesus paid the price. But also in the shadow of the cross, there's the right to cancel anyone else, because their sin is canceled too by the gift and grace of God. We are all sinners. We all fall short. But thanks be to our God, whose love is forever, whose love is eternal, who would not allow anything that we have done or anything that has been done to us to ever cancel the work that he created in us and the work that he sent his Son to bring to fruition, fulfillment, for us to become truly his sons and daughters. So if you're here this morning and you're feeling canceled because of your age, because of your gender, because of your sexual orientation, because of your race or ethnicity or your income level or because of whatever, God loves you. You are not canceled. You are his son. You are his daughter. And you are loved eternally forever. God sees good things in you. And if you're here today and you're struggling because someone hurt you, someone said something against you, and you're having a tough time, wondering if you can stay in that relationship, wondering if you can feel anything other than hate towards that person, I simply ask that you would allow the grace of Jesus Christ to cancel your hate, to soothe your hurt. Remember that the same Christ who died for you died for them, and through the love of the Father and the forgiveness of the Son, extend to them the best you can the grace and the respect that God has shown to us, because that's what we all need. Amen. Bob, will you come join me for a minute? I am in this series we've been doing. We've had, each week the assisting pastor or staff member, in Bob's case, is taking a moment to share with me a little bit of the message. And I asked Bob specifically for this week because he has a particular history, a story to tell that's very powerful. Whenever I talk to other pastors who are retired, who've been longer in ministry than I have, almost all of them reflect that this current political moment we're in reminds them of the late 60s, early 70s, and the Vietnam period. That civil rights movements, sexual revolution, but especially Vietnam, how polarizing that was within our country. And Bob served in Vietnam, and I invited him to share a little bit about both that experience, but also his experience coming home and what that was like. So, Bob, why don't you take it away?
Well, many of you know I grew up wanting to be a pastor. All through school, almost from the time I could figure out what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a Lutheran pastor, and worked toward that goal, and was in college getting ready for that. Within the Lutheran Church, it's an 8-year program, 4 years 4 years working on your clergy stuff. And on my second year, I had two friends who challenged me because we were arguing about Vietnam almost constantly. It was early in the war, and it was a big topic of conversation. And they said, Bob, if you believe so much that we should be there, put your money where your mouth is. And I thought about that a lot, and at the end of the semester did just that. I volunteered for the Army, and I volunteered for Vietnam. Well, the Army, in its great knowledge, sent me to Germany instead of Vietnam. And I spent 2 years in Germany. During that time, I volunteered for Vietnam 3 more times. And the third time they finally sent me, I spent about 15 months in Vietnam, serving as a MACV advisor. That means I lived, breathed, ate, and slept with the Vietnamese instead of the Americans. My unit was 16 American soldiers and 6,000 Vietnamese combat rangers. I finished that time and got ready to come home. I flew home into San Francisco. We landed, they took my uniforms away from me. I had to have them for the future, but they took them away from me and said, we will ship these home. We want you to take off your uniform, put on civilian clothes. Never talk about where you were, never talk about what you did, never talk about your time in the Army. The country was being torn apart by Vietnam and the argument about whether we should be there and what was being done there, by race relations, by you name it. Everybody hated somebody. And it was a time where people couldn't even talk to each other very well. I also came home in the middle of the My Lai trials. 2 units of American troops had shot to death almost 500 Vietnamese family members, women, children, and the trials were going on of those American soldiers at that time. So feelings were really, really high. Well,
But I remember you said to me, like, the effect of that on you was to take 4 years of your life and just cancel it, right? Wipe it out. Like,
it basically said to me, number one, everything you believe and everything you did was wrong. And you should feel guilty for it, and you should feel bad for it. And anything that happened in Vietnam was your fault. That was the feeling we all got. And a lot of things happened in Vietnam we didn't want to have happen. I flew home and very bluntly couldn't go back to school in seminary. Didn't feel I had the moral fortitude to become a pastor. For the next 20 years, I never held a job for more than 3 years. I never lived at the same town for more than 3 years. I was just kind of lost. I was floating around, not knowing who I was or what I wanted to do. Then things settled down a little bit, and my life was much better until about 40 years after I got out of Vietnam. At almost exactly 40 years, I was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer. a direct result of Vietnam. I had been around Agent Orange, and it's pretty clear signature of cancer. I spent 5 days in intensive care, and at the end of that time was ready to go home. And as I walked out of the door of my room, the entire staff of the hospital section I was in, which was like 15, 20 people, were lined up. And they shook my hand and said, "Thank you for your service." It was the first time anybody had said thank you for that and even recognized what I did. I was a mess, which I always am when I tell this story, sorry. But it changed the way I looked at that 4 years. For the first time in 40 years, I could admit that 4 years of my life existed. I could admit that I was in Vietnam. I could recognize the good I did there, because I did do some good, and recognize the mistakes we made there. At that point, I started wearing a Vietnam hat or a shirt or whatever. If people talked about the war, I admitted I was there. Cindy, who's way in the back right now, didn't even know I'd been in Vietnam until that time. Nobody knew I had been in Vietnam. I never talked about it. There's an organization out there that their catchphrase is, "Vietnam didn't kill me, but it's still trying." And I think it's very much where many of us feel. So from that point on, I was able to recognize that part of my life was acceptable and I didn't have to hide it, and to let go of the guilt and the hurt and the just feeling dirty that I had felt for 40 years. And it made my life so much more complete.
Talk about your experience serving downtown.
I moved to Indianapolis 35 years ago, and shortly after that got a divorce. And in that divorce, my wife had our daughter on holiday weekends. I called my pastor at that time and said, "What can I do? I'm free. I have no family here." And he sent me to a little mission downtown that was serving meals on Sundays. I started working there, and that began 18 years of service to the homeless here in Indianapolis. Most of you know the mission that we work at downtown right now is called Soup on Wheels. And we still support that organization. I ran their kitchen for 17 years. At the time I started down there, though, almost 75% of the guys we served were Vietnam vets. And that's probably an accurate number of the number of people that came home and never came back. Their life ended in Vietnam. Their productive, happy, normal life ended when they were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, because they couldn't ever get out of Vietnam. And the cost of that to me is just amazing. Now, those guys are all gone. You don't live on the street 18 years. You just don't survive that long. But there are still way too many folks on the street that are veterans. But that experience taught me that I can still serve. The other thing it taught me is it's okay to tell people to talk about Vietnam. And today, this happened a couple years ago. I was out somewhere and saw a vet wearing a hat and said, "Hi," and he said, "Welcome home, brother." And I listened to that for a minute and thought about it and thought that's what we should be doing. And so now when I see a guy that I know was in Vietnam, whether it's because he's wearing clothing or whatever, my greeting to him is always, "Welcome home, brother." First thing you learned in Vietnam is don't get to know anybody. They weren't going to be around long. Many people didn't survive. They got hurt, whatever. So you just kept your distance from everybody. And yet we were all brothers. We all paid the same price for that year of our life. Nobody came home from Vietnam whole. Nobody came home from Vietnam with their spirit and their heart intact. We all left something there. And it cost us all.
And Bob just told me that story this morning as we were doing a practice before the service, and I thought, that phrase, welcome home, brother, particularly on a Sunday when we had the prodigal son story. And what the older brother could not bring himself to say, welcome home, brother, and what our country couldn't bring itself to say when you came home, welcome home, brother. Yet how healing and powerful just that simple phrase can be.
It is frightening that we abandoned a whole generation of young men. We walked away from them and said, you're not worth saving. And we can never do that again. So that's my preaching point tonight.
Yeah. Bob, thank you for your service, and thank you for your service to our church, for the many gifts you still bring. I think it's funny how God brings our stories full circle, and you may not carry the credentials, but you are a pastor to so many in our church, and I thank you for it. And you're going to lead us in prayer, but before you, is just any last words you want to say?
I think what I said just now is for me. We can never abandon people again. I don't care whether they're black, white, green, or yellow. I don't care whether they're Republicans or Democrats. I don't care if they're gay or whatever. We can never abandon people. They are God's, and they are precious, and we have to fight for them. And even if they want to be abandoned, we can't abandon them.
Thank you, Bob.